Thank you, Senator, for coming. The question I have really, I think, goes to the American dream. And in my American dream, I don't need that. In my American dream, our politics are not flooded with dark money from billionaires, corporations, unions, and special interests. Our democracy is being destroyed by this big money politics. If you're elected president, what, if anything, will you do to help get rid of this cancer on our democracy?
Well, I would point two things out. The first is that we do have a constitutional right to speech. And I believe political donations are part of that speech, but it has to be disclosed. So what I've always said is, people supporting with full disclosure and sunlight into all of these expenditures is critical to getting to the root of this problem. Now, I can tell you how I proceed. I tell people where I stand. And then people can decide to support me or oppose me. And some support me and some oppose me. But I believe disclosure is the critical. As long as you know who's behind the money and how much they're giving and where they're spending it, I think that's the sunlight that we need and the sunshine that we need to give the American people a clear understanding about who and what the agenda is. But ultimately, you shouldn't be in politics and you shouldn't be in public office unless you're allowed to adopt the old adage that Ronald Reagan used to tell people. And that is, you buy into my agenda, I don't buy into yours. And that's how I've always tried to govern myself. Now, the truth be told about the money, it often gets criticized in the press. And I always remind our friends in the press that when they stop charging us for ads, we'll stop raising money. So there is a need to communicate. And I honestly do believe that for those of us who believe in limited government and free enterprise, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult for us to communicate than it is for the left. And we get beat up year-round by many outlets who I don't think treat us the same way they do some of the folks on the left of the debate.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
That's right.
I just want to, I had an opportunity to meet with Mitt Romney in 2012, and I begged him, I said, Mitt, tell the Californians, I said, the place is an absolute mess. 63 of 65 representatives are Democratic, and they can't join one year. And my daughter lives in Illinois, which is now surpassed California as the #1 fiscal mess. And my question is this: whose responsibility, or why don't we do a better job of pointing out what a fiscal disaster socialism is, comparing this state to that state, so that there is some background to your comments about small government, business, and less regulation. Compare that. But that's, I don't know if it's just going to be a country store or the box. I've always felt the Republican National Committee has a huge void in telling and backing up that.
Well, your point is well taken. We are, in fact, in our own country have evidence of what happened. So Florida is an example of a state that's prospering because it has no state income tax. And so people think they're coming down just because of the weather. Well, it's true, the weather's pretty good. But it's not just the weather. It is easier to afford to do business in Florida than it is in many other states in the country. Texas is a similar experience as well. And you've seen states that have grown as a result of creating a friendlier climate to work, to do business, to create jobs, and to have prosperity. So you're right about that as an example, but I think that's also true for the world. I mean, if you look at the world today, the nations that have grown economically are the ones that have embraced free enterprise. The nations that have now, obviously, their definition of free enterprise may be different in some instances, right? What you and I would define as free enterprise. But what is attracting people to some economies versus others is, how much do I have to pay in taxes? What's the regulatory burden? How difficult is it to go from point A to point B? How hard is it to start a business? And by the way, here's one of the secrets about big government that we don't talk about nearly enough. Big government doesn't hurt the big corporations. Big government doesn't hurt the people who have made it. And we're not against big companies or big, they have a role to play. We're not against people that have made it. We celebrate their success. But if you are a mega multinational corporation, and I bury you with a bunch of regulations and taxes, you can hire the best lawyers to help navigate it, the best lobbyists to help fix it. If you're trying to start a business out of the spare bedroom of your home, not only are you in violation of the zoning code, depending on where you live, but you can't deal with all those sorts of things. And oftentimes, here's something I write about in my latest book, oftentimes it is big businesses or big industries that support those regulations because they know it keeps an innovative competitor out of the marketplace from coming after them. So we need to do a better job of telling that as well, because one of the big myths out there is that somehow big government helps the people who are trying to make it, and it isn't so. It isn't true. Yes, sir.
It struck me that your father ought to be proud of you, not only as a U.S. Senator, but your business, manufacturing state, it's now good to be able to drink. I heard a couple of guys give you
Can't hear you.
I said,
the senator has made a fashion statement that he now can drink in front of TV or any audience, drink out of a bottle of water. Poland's bringing water. Anyhow, the question I have is, I'm not going to put you on the spot to make a comment about what Rudy Giuliani has said, but Giuliani has come out with some statements.
but and the basis of some of the statements is that the mass media is opaque to your message. Okay, it just NBC, CBS, ABC will not transmit your message to the greater population of the United States who's not here in this barn listening to you. Okay, how are you going to break through those people and get to the people who really need to listen to what you're saying, who are not currently have not bought into your agenda, but should be?
Well, a couple points. I don't know if you got the questions. Look, if you're a conservative who believes in limited government, every game that we play is an away game. I mean, we're off. There's not. That's a fact. I believe that. I used to believe it a lot less until I got into the game. You're not treated the same. So here's the truth. First of all, let me just say up front, I love Rudy Giuliani. I have tremendous admiration for Rudy Giuliani. And he's supported. When I was running for the Senate, and not a lot of people thought I could win, Rudy Giuliani was one of the few people in America who came down to help me at the initial stage, and I'm always grateful for it. I believe the president loves his country. I just think his ideas are bad for America. But here's my bigger point, and I'm not comparing Rudy Giuliani to Joe Biden, but every single day, Joe Biden says something that would end my career if I said it once.
Yeah.
And I never hear Democrats having to answer for him. So I just wonder, why is it that I must always answer for someone else in my party when they say it? I think Rudy Giuliani's allowed his opinion. He's a big boy, he's a strong man, he can defend himself. And so I do think that points to some of that bias that you've outlined. As far as how we get our message across, here's the good news. The good news is that when they hear our message, the majority of Americans know it's true. And so while it may be harder for us to get our message out sometimes, I think our message rings true when people hear it. And I think that's what's helpful to us. That ultimately when people hear from us, they tend to agree with us. And you see the evidence of it. And the fact that Republicans now have a majority in the Senate and in the House, and most governor's mansions around the country, and most legislative branches around the country. In fact, the only place where Republicans really haven't been successful in the last few years has been winning the White House. And we're working on that.
What do we do about the national debt?
The question's about the national debt. First, let's understand that the national debt is not just an accounting problem. It's a job creation killer. Because the national debt creates uncertainty about America's long-term and mid-term future, and it discourages people from investing in our future. Not to mention that it's sucking money out of the economy to service that debt that can be going to entrepreneurship and job creation, etc. The vast majority of our national debt is driven not by foreign aid, that's less than 1% of our budget, not by fraud and abuse, which is significant, but is not what's driving the debt. The debt is driven because we have entitlement programs that I support, but that are currently structured in an unsustainable way. And I say this to you as someone who represents the state of Florida. My mother's on Medicare. I would never do anything to Medicare that would hurt my mother. But I understand that my generation's Medicare has to look different than my mother's does, or it won't exist. And that's what's driving our long-term debt. The only way we can deal with our debt, we have to do two things about it. One is we have to constrain spending, primarily through entitlement reform in the ways that have been outlined by people like Paul Ryan and others. And second, we have to have dynamic economic growth. Because where the debt matters most is what percentage of your economic size is. So if we had a $1 trillion debt in America, $1 trillion as opposed to 18 trillion, we would be very happy with that.
Yeah.
But if Italy has a $1 trillion debt, that's catastrophic because their economy is much smaller than ours. So the combination of economic growth and fiscal constraint is what brings that debt to a manageable level. And that's what we have to do. And neither one is politically easy to do, but we have to. In essence, I would actually tell you the entitlement reform part is going to happen one way or the other. It either happens now when we do it as part of a plan and we keep it from being disrupted and we hold harmless the people that are already retired like my mother, or we wait till it becomes a crisis and then we have to scramble to fix it and it does become disruptive and it does hurt people that are on those programs now. So we do have to reform those entitlement programs. Without it, you'll never balance the budget. They are the long-term drivers of our debt.
Senator Rubio, my name is John Coolidge. I'd like to thank you a lot for coming out to our little town. When I first heard of you, I liked you a lot, and then you lost me, animated and racist. But I'm back, and here to give you another chance. But my question for you is, can you commit, as elected president, to sending home every single person that's violated our country's laws and is here illegally?
I don't think anyone can commit that to you. You have 12 million human beings in America. Most of them, we don't even know who they are. And some of whom our country's not going to tolerate rounding up and sending back. That's not a realistic proposal. I will tell you what I'll commit to. The first thing I'll commit to is the one thing we should be doing right now. And that's creating systems to be able to enforce our immigration laws that we don't have in place today. For example, we have 3 sectors of the southern border that remain insecure. 3 sectors of the southern border that don't have enough fencing, don't have enough patrols, don't have enough cameras, don't have enough surveillance, don't have enough of the mechanics that it takes to secure the border. The second thing we don't realize is that 40% of illegal immigrants came to the country legally and overstayed visas. In essence, they got off an airplane with a 90-day visa, and on day 91 they were still here and are still here. We have no idea who most of them are because we log you in, but we never track when you leave. So there's no counting, there's no running tally on who's here and who isn't. And the third is we don't have any verified system. Employment is often the magnet that brings people to our shores. But we don't have a system that employers can use in a cost-effective, time-effective way that they can verify that the person they're hiring is legally here or not. If you do those 3 things, you will help bring future illegal immigration way under control. And that's not where we are today. Once we've done that, the second thing we have to do is we have to have a legal immigration system that works. Now, you may or may not know this, most of you probably do. 1 million people a year immigrate legally to the United States permanently. There isn't a country in the world that comes close to that number. So think about it this way. Every single year there are 3 million new Americans. 2 million are born, 1 million immigrate here. The problem is that they immigrate here on a 20th century system that doesn't work for us anymore. In essence, it is easier to immigrate here if you have a relative living here than if you have a special economic contribution to make to the future of our country. And that needs to change too. We need to modernize our legal immigration system so that it's more merit-based than simply family-based. And the third aspect of it is, what do you do with 10 million, 8 million, 9 million people that have been here for a long period of time, but have otherwise not violated our laws except for that? Now, if you're a criminal, you're a felon, you've committed serious crimes, you can't stay. There's no doubt about it. If you've not been here that long, or you just tried to take advantage of some changes in the law, you're going to have to leave as well. But I do think that people are willing to be reasonable and responsible about what to do with people that are here illegally, but not until those other 2 things have happened, and not until they are sure that this problem will never happen again. That's the only way forward, I think.
Over here?
Yes, sir.
The welfare department, you get on the Springfield, the tallest building in town is full of people who are on welfare. And most of them immigrants. I've seen that all over the place. It's a tremendous welfare system. Why is it the welfare system tied in to?
Well, the truth be told is, obviously some states have made an exception like California and others, but the truth be told is, if you're here illegally in this country, you shouldn't be receiving welfare benefits, or you shouldn't be receiving even Obamacare, you shouldn't be receiving any of these things. Now, some states have allowed it, they've made exceptions like California and so forth, and they're paying the price for it. It acts as a magnet. But at the end of the day, I still believe the vast majority of people that immigrate here legally especially are looking for a job and a better future. But you're going to have abuses of the system, and we have to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. And even in the bill that was not very popular, it said that if you were in this country illegally, you couldn't qualify for any federal benefits of any sort. And it's one of the problems that exists with the executive order the president recently signed. And that is that it allows, this is not always viewed as a benefit, but it allows you to file taxes going back 3 years, which would make many people eligible for the earned income tax credit, which could add up to over $20,000 a year, which we never even budgeted for. And all those folks that are being legalized would qualify for something like that.
Senator.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to change the subject just a little bit and go back to something you said about education. I'm one of the people that later in life going back to retool and get my master's in technology, information technology from a Southern New Hampshire university completely online. There's one, and so we're lucky to have a university here that's really targeted on that worldwide. And doing.
Are you working as well while you're doing your studies?
I'm actually right now disabled. I had a stroke and lost vision in my left side of my. But I'm not laying down. I'm not going to quit. I just got to retool and get back to work. My question is twofold. Number one, do you see can Southern New Hampshire University be used as a model for other universities throughout the country, and should be looked at very highly? They've made billions of dollars in tuitions just because of their program. And number two is on Common Core, which goes to our youth and our early elementary school kids and so forth, and it's a national mandate of incredible proportions, which is really dismantling of the traditions of local education run and supported by local communities.
Yeah, let me just handle the second one first on Common Core. Look, my biggest concern with Common Core is that it will be turned into a weapon by the federal government. It'll turn into a mandate. That in essence, federal funding of education will be tied to it. And if you do what they want, if you follow their standards, you'll get the money, and if you don't, they'll cut you off. And the problem that I have with that is I don't want there to be a national school board. I want there to be a local school board that you and I or anybody else can go into and complain or be heard about. I think education is always best when it's run at the local and state level. And in fact, the competition among states for better curriculum, better teachers, and better quality drives excellence. And I'm afraid we can lose that, especially if you have a national standard that goes from being a carrot to a stick. And the federal government never is able to help itself. It's turned virtually every carrot into a stick, and it does so fairly quickly. On your first question about alternative learning, look, I think traditional four-year schools that have innovative programs could be part of the solution. But I also think part of the solution is to drive more innovation into that space. Right now, to offer a four-year degree and get the federal government to pay for it through student loans or a grant, you have to be accredited by an accrediting board. The problem is those accrediting boards are controlled by the schools that are accredited. So in essence, they are against any sort of alternative ways of learning. What I'm arguing is there should be alternative ways of acquiring those same skills. For example, you've been working and you've been living for all these years. There are certain things you already know that you should be given credit for. That shouldn't force you to sit in a classroom and take courses and pay for things that you already learned. And right now, we don't have a viable way for people, we do have a viable way. What we don't have is broad recognition by the private sector that learning by packaging learning from various sources is the equivalent of a college degree. And we need to move forward in that direction by alternative accrediting systems that allow us to accredit programs that allow you to package learning and that allow you to get credit for things you already know, so we can cut down on the amount of time and the amount of expense that it takes to be certified or credentialed to work.
Senator?
Way in the back, yes, sir.
I am Frank Tudesi. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you said, and I think philosophically we're on the same page. What I have is a greater fear of what happens between now and 2016. Where are we now, and will we even be in a place then that even if you are elected, you have any chance to do anything about what occurs? So my question is, what can the legislative branch of our government do to start doing their job? And I see it as taking the presidential, the executive branch to task. That's our checks and balances. Without checks and balances, we find ourselves where we are today. And I see that we have Republican-controlled Senate, Republican-controlled House, and they're focusing on things like the Keystone Pipeline. It's like the Keystone Cops. It's really not what we need focus on. We have a gentleman in the White House who has told the biggest lie on the biggest taxation that this country has ever seen. We have one that has constantly violated the Constitution and therefore not upheld his oath of office. If we don't take him to task, look at the precedent that we are setting. So any president can go in and do anything he wants because, oh, they've done it before. It's time, whether we impeach him, whatever we do, and even if he doesn't get thrown out of office, the Republicans need to go on record as saying that enough is enough. You do not let a person run rogue on this country and all those things that you've espoused that I believe in. I came from a blue-collar family. I spent 10 years paying off college loans too. And I became successful just through hard work, and my wife the same way. But we're allowing this man to tread all over this country, whether he loves it or not. I don't believe he loves it as it is, or as it was, and he's doing his best to turn it into something that you said, as well as everybody knows, is not appropriate for America, and it's not appropriate for the world. So what can we do?
That's actually one of the most common questions that I've gotten as I've talked to people, and that is, what can we do now before the next 2 years? I'd make 2 points in that regard. For example, people don't realize it, but we have the ability to overturn regulations and regulate through majority votes. Not through supermajority votes, through majority votes in the House and Senate. And we should have an aggressive policy of doing that, of overturning regulatory frameworks that he's put in place, particularly some of these radical environmental policies that are setting America backwards. The second thing, and I think that the plan is, once they finish this DHS debate, to exactly move to that, one of those items right away in the Senate. And I imagine the House would follow suit as well. Here's the second point I would make. I think it's important for us to pass things, even if he vetoes them, that show the American people that there's a different way. In essence, so that we're not just the opposition, but we're the alternative. But here's the third point I would make, and this speaks to a broader narrative. We should never confuse our country for our government. They're not the same thing. America's a lot more than a government. We've had bad presidents before, and we still remained a great country despite it. And we'll still be a great country if we do the right things. In essence, our country is much more than just one president, one government, or a handful of laws. This country, the base of this country, the foundation of this country, is not its senators, its congressmen, or its president. The foundation of this country are people that get up every morning and go to work for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They pay their taxes, they donate and volunteer at charities, they're raising their families, and that's still happening every morning, irrespective of what he's doing or not doing. And we should never forget that our country is much bigger than one president or one 8-year period of time. Now, I agree, there are things you can do over those 8 years that are harmful to America and its future. And we need to show people there's a better way forward and actually begin to put as many of those in practice now and set the stage to put as many of them in practice in the future. But we should never confuse our country for our government. We are still capable of being a great country now and moving forward, even after these 8 years of terrible policies.
But all socialist countries are also capable of it, but they're strangled by a government.
Well, I honestly believe the American people have learned over the last 6 years that his form of policies don't work. If you look at it today, there are more people in poverty, there are more people underemployed, there are more people out of the marketplace, and that's the very people he claimed he was going to help are the ones that have been hurt the most over the last 6 or 7 years. And that will create, for those of us who do not agree with what he's done, an opportunity. But an opportunity that we need to fill, not simply by saying, we're not him, so vote for us. An opportunity to say, here's what we would do instead. And here's the other thing I would say. Many of our answers don't come from the government. Many of the things that we need to be doing are not about the government doing anything other than getting out of your way, so that people can go out and start businesses and hire more people and succeed economically and get ahead in life. There are some things we want the government to do, primarily national security, but there are a lot of other issues, things that government should do. But many of our answers don't lie in our elected officials. They lie in elected officials that understand that government has its limits, and that when it exceeds those limits, it does more harm than good.
Thank you.
Senator, go back to the DHS thing for a second. I know there's been a lot of discussion as far as you're looking at that, whether it ought to be a clean bill or not. I think my biggest concern is this executive action, which is a travesty. How do we get leverage in the Senate and the House to overturn this thing? Because as you're probably aware, Texas is an example. 20,000 illegals have crossed the border since January 1st, just in Texas. How do we overturn this thing? Because according to 2 states right now, I believe it's Texas and Illinois, if this thing goes through and the stay is overturned, that all these folks can be able to vote. And I don't think we're going to have a clean election ever again if this happens. How do we get leverage with this president? I know you were talking about your vote on this. If it's not attached to the DHS funding bill, we've got to turn this thing around, this executive action.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't believe we should pass a clean DHS bill. What I pointed out is the fact that it's very difficult to pass anything on it now because of the Democrats. They refuse to give 60 votes to get on it. They refuse to give us enough votes to even debate it, not to mention enough votes to overturn a presidential veto. But here's what we should have started doing weeks ago, and it doesn't get again, we'll go back to some of the issues we talked about before, with some of the coverage on this. There are three fundamental problems with this. The first is that 22 times in the past, this president said he did not have the authority to do what he did.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I missed it, but I don't think the Constitution's been amended in the last 2 years. So somehow, over those last 2 years, he went from not having the authority to do it to concluding that he did. So that alone needs to be pointed out, because what's at stake here is not the issue, it's the constitutional principle behind it, the separation of powers, the balance of power in our republic.
Absolutely.
And that's a critical issue. That goes to the heart of what our country's been about in terms of our government. And let me point an example of something. And I tell some people all the time, I believe the corporate tax rate should be lowered in America. I think it's too high. I think it makes us uncompetitive. But if tomorrow morning a Republican president announced by executive action that he would only collect up to 25% of the taxes, not 35%, which is the rate, I would oppose it. Even though I agree with the outcome, even though I agree with the policy, I would oppose it. Because the president does not have the authority to write law in the way they enforce the law. And that's the problem. That's the first problem. The second problem with it is its unintended consequences of it.
Absolutely.
And or some argue the intended consequences of it. But I believe the unintended consequences of it, that by doing this, you are creating a magnet for a future migratory crisis, and there is evidence behind it.
Absolutely.
And here's what it is. When they did the deferred action for the young people back in 2012, that directly led to the migratory crisis on the southern border. Because what happened, this was told to me by leaders in Honduras. I didn't read this, on Drudge or somewhere else. I was told this by leaders of those countries. What happened was that transnational criminal groups went around handing out pamphlets and even running ads telling people there's a new law in America that if you come there as a child illegally, you will get to stay.
Right.
And so tens of thousands of people came. And so we know that the previous executive order led to that migratory crisis. Imagine what this new one's going to do that applies to even a broader population of people. And here's the third point. Fixing all the things we talked about on immigration become harder to do after this. Become more difficult to do after this. It deliberately poisons the well on immigration reform of any sort. In terms of modernizing the system, increasing enforcement. For those three reasons, we should do everything we can to stop this from moving forward.
Well, how do we do that?
Well, I think we do that by calling attention to the Democrats, at least 6 or 7 of them, that went around the country this fall saying they were against the executive order, and now won't even let us debate the bill. And there's not been enough attention paid to that. To the Al Frankens in Minnesota and the other people that ran for office saying, I don't agree with the executive order. I'm not in favor of the executive order. But now when the time comes to vote on it, to at least just understand what they're filibustering. What they're filibustering is not even the bill. It's what they're filibustering is to begin debate on the bill.
Right.
That's outrageous. If we do that, it's called a shutdown. If they do that, it's called we're shutting down. No matter what, it's us shutting it down. When we filibuster, we get accused of shutting down the government. When they filibuster, we get accused of shutting down the government too.
So you
We've
need
got to point to that hypocrisy.
So you need 60 votes in the Senate, really?
Well,
to
we need
move
60
this?
votes to even get on the
to
bill.
get it, yeah.
60 bills to pass it, and 68 votes to overturn a presidential veto. But I'm telling you, there are at least 6 or 7 Democrats that went all over the state saying they were against the executive order, and now they're hiding behind this vote.
Senator, can you say a few words about your views about Cuba, the situation?
About Cuba?
Yes.
Well, I have only one interest when it comes to Cuba. I want the Cuban people to have what every nation in the Western Hemisphere has had at least once in the last decade and a half, and that's a free and fair election. I don't want them to have anything more in terms of democracy than what, for example, people in the Dominican Republic have had, which is a free and fair election. And then I think a free Cuban people can decide any economic model they want. That's what I care about, and I will support any policy that furthers that. I oppose what the president has done because I think it sets it back, and here's why. First of all, it rewards the Cuban government with what they want, which is more American dollars. People will say, well, you're going to flood their economy with more American economic activity. The problem people don't understand is the Cuban government is the gatekeeper. They decide what economic activity gets in and which economic activity does not. So ask that to the Italian company that own 27% of their telecom industry and invested money in their telecom industry and then were forced out. And the Cuban government took over their entire telecom industry. Ask it to the hotel companies that are allowed to flag a hotel under their name, but the employees in the hotel work for the government, the profits go to the government, and you just get a management. So we're rewarding this tyrannical regime with the economic opening they want and abandoning the democratic aspirations of people who are fighting every single day on that island for the opportunity to select their leaders and have a democratic vote. And we did all that in a deal that the president cut. And here's the deal. We're going to do more telecommunications, more travel, more remittances, more business activity. That's what we gave them. What they gave in return is they freed 53 prisoners. Of the 53, 14 were already free. All were conditionally released. At least a handful have already been rearrested. And by the way, last year they arrested 8,000 people. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, they've arrested 200 people in Cuba alone. And by the way, so the people that think that Cuba's some sort of Cold War relic, harmless, old guys that were once with the Soviet Union but don't matter anymore, Cuba is probably the third most active intelligence agency against the United States. It steals American secrets in New York, Miami, Washington, and it sells them to our enemies on the global platform. The Cuban government is an ally of Iran, an ally of the Russians and Putin, an ally of the Chinese government. In fact, there's a Chinese and Russian intelligence gathering capability on the island of Cuba targeted against the United States. Last year, the Cuban government was caught smuggling weapons to North Korea through the Panama Canal in violation of UN treaty and violation of UN sanctions. And by the way, the president's reward for all these openings he's done to Cuba is about a month ago, Raul Castro came back and said, oh, by the way, there are some additional conditions that we want. If you want to have diplomatic relations with us, we want Guantanamo Bay back. And we want $160 million of reparation, $160 billion of reparation for the embargo. So I think the president's going to end up being embarrassed by this deal. And I think nations around the world, like Iran and North Korea and others, are watching and are saying, this is a weak president who can be taken advantage of in negotiations. Other than that, I think it's fine. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here, Senator. I appreciated you talking about cronyism and bloated spending in the government. We see corporations and other special interests spending billions on campaign donations and lobbying and getting sometimes a whole lot more than that back from the side of the government. I wonder if there are any specific reforms that you can to make sure people avoid non-big special interests that are.
Well, there are two primary ways in which big government helps big business at the expense of a competitor. The first is through the regulatory code. So imagine for a moment if I could take you back 20 years in your Blockbuster Video, and you're able to pass a federal law that says, in order to rent a movie, you must do so personally, must rent a video cassette from a store. Because we want to make sure kids aren't getting their hands on rated R movies. If you had been able to pass a law like that, there would never have been Netflix or any ability to download online. That happens every day. So I think the regulatory code is the first place that you find some of these protections built in. And so one of the things I've called for is called a regulatory budget. And what it will force is for agencies to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. And here's what it will work. These are not the exact numbers. I'm just throwing this out there as a raw number. Let's say that next year we calculated that regulations cost the American economy $1 trillion a year to comply with. And then Congress came out and said, next year, the budget you have is $700 billion. Regulations can only have a $700 billion cost impact on the economy. That would force federal agencies to reduce $300 billion worth of regulatory costs. They would now have to undergo a cost-benefit analysis to get rid of those things that they don't want or that they're willing to get rid of because of the cost-benefit analysis. Again, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a magical solution. We can always overturn specific regulations through the process I've outlined earlier. But that would be a way to get control on the growth of regulations. Right now, most regulations in America have nothing to do with cost-benefit analysis. They're purely made by unelected bureaucrats in an agency who decide this sounds like a really good idea, and no one ever asks, how many jobs will this destroy? How many people will it put out of business? What impact will this have on our competitiveness? And the second place you find it is in the tax code. The tax code is full of loopholes and exemptions that are built into it for purposes of helping a favored industry one way or the other, or at least industries that are able to handle a complex code. And here's where I go, the majority of American business activity today, especially smaller businesses, is through the personal code, through the S code. They're paying on their personal rates. But big businesses are largely paying on the C corporation rate. And that's why simplifying the tax code, getting the rate as low as possible, and removing as many exemptions as possible is the direction we need to go. Now that's easier said than done. I recognize it. But that's the other place where we see some of this built in. But ultimately, look, if Hillary Clinton runs for president, she will get more money out of Wall Street than any presidential campaign ever. And that's a fact. And part of the reason is because many of these industries feel very comfortable with her there. They understand that their preeminence in terms of, for example, the way interest rates are set in monetary policies done in the United States is benefiting them at the expense of a retired couple that's saving money in a savings account, or a small business that's trying to take out a loan at a traditional bank. And they can't because those community banks can no longer comply with Dodd-Frank. So they're either bought up by one of the big banks and are forced to close down. So these are the sorts of things we need to talk about more, because this misconception has been created, that somehow big government helps the people we're trying to make it, and nothing could be further from the truth. Is our last one, I guess? Okay, yes, sir.
Several times you've talked about the tax code, and we've all heard about modifying the tax code or reforming the tax code. I'm wondering if you're aware of the fair tax and what your thoughts are on that, which is not the flat tax.
No, the fair tax is the consumption tax.
Consumption tax.
So when I was the Speaker of the Florida House, I had a plan to get rid of the property tax and replace it with a statewide consumption tax. Because I believe the property tax was unfair. It taxes you on the theoretical value of your property. Just because your property is worth more than it once was doesn't mean you have the cash in the bank to pay for it. Meanwhile, the consumption tax, especially if you exempt necessities like food and medicine and so forth, is something that you could that everyone pays, and you can measure a lot more. The problem with a fair tax at the national level, quite frankly, is I don't think the support is there to do it. I don't think it will be there in the foreseeable future. There's always the fear that you have to pass it in conjunction with a constitutional amendment, because if you leave the income tax in place, a future government's going to come in and reimpose the income tax, but now you're stuck with a consumption tax as well. And so I believe that for our country at this moment, the better approach is to simplify and flatten the tax rate. But I think there's a lot of good points made by supporters of the fair tax in terms of if you were to start a country from scratch, you would probably want to tax on the basis of consumption. I don't think that it's realistic, in my personal opinion, to achieve that today at a time when we have to become globally competitive very quickly. I guess we're wrapping up, ma'am. This is the last one. Well, I'm glad, Brent, that you asked that question. So about 3 years ago, in 2011, the Congress passed a law, a budget law, and it made horrifying cuts to defense, because nobody thought Congress was crazy enough to go through with it. Their argument was, these cuts are so bad, these cuts are so devastating, that it will force them to do a deal on the long-term debt. Well, they underestimated Congress's craziness, because they didn't do the deal on the long-term debt, and now we're stuck with those reductions in spending. And let me tell you why that's problematic. That's not just problematic today, in terms of how many planes we have. That is problematic, by the way, but that alone is not enough. Our Navy is on schedule to be smaller than it's ever been, certainly in the modern era, in comparison to China, which is trying to build a 300-ship Navy only for the Pacific, not worldwide the way we have. But let me tell you where these cuts are really going to hurt us long-term, and that is in the high ground on technology and innovation. We all love, for our Commander-in-Chief, to have the latest, greatest technology that saves lives, targets attacks, make us more effective. We have had the technological high ground on national defense since the end of World War II. We will lose that technological high ground if we continue with the cuts that are in place today. We will stop investing in research and development. We will lose that research and development capability, because these scientists and these inventors and these innovators in the defense field are not going to sit around and wait. They're going to go off and migrate to other professions and other fields, and we will lose the technological high ground. And in about 8 to 10 years, what you are impacting is what options will be available to a future Commander-in-Chief. Meanwhile, China is undergoing the most rapid expansion of a modern military in the last century. And over time, if that disparity continues to increase, you're going to trigger miscalculation and aggressive action on their part in the Asia-Pacific region. Not to mention things like missile defense that this nation will need in the era of proliferation. Not to mention the ability to gather intelligence. at a time when we have more threats, both domestic and foreign, than we've seen since 9/11. And so we cannot continue down this front. And that's why I called for increased military spending in conjunction with entitlement reform, because that's the driver of our debt. The defense spending is not the driver of our debt. Now, is there waste in defense contracting? Yes. There's waste in every contract, and we need to reduce it. We need to eliminate it if possible. But we cannot leave this country vulnerable, because every time this country has slashed defense spending, it's had to come back and make up for it. And it's cost more money, and it's been more dangerous as a result of it. You always lose when you do it that way. We cannot allow this to continue. We have always told our men and women in uniform that we will never put you in a fair fight. You will always be the best trained and best equipped people on the ground. We won't be able to keep that promise if you keep doing what we're doing. So I'm grateful. Thank you. I'm grateful that you would come here to listen to me this afternoon, and I look forward to coming back again and talking to you more, many, many more times. Thank you very much.
GrokTV.